Cops of Reddit, what is the saddest thing a criminal has said? I nicked a guy for attempted murder once. I had met him before a few times, usually when he was a suspect. He just said, even now, you're still the closest thing I've got to a proper friend. Ex-cop. Speaking to a juvenile in the cells with a buttload of warrants for stealing cars and armed robberies, told me the only way he could get toys is if he stole them, and his parents would never help him with his homework but showed him what to say to get free McDonald's, and how to avoid getting caught shoplifting. Some kids have no hope, and are just going to end up in the system. Having to charge a person for a sex crime, when you investigated them as a child victim years before. His mother had that same expression of despair each time. Edit, incredible response. I can provide a bit of update. The adult was a very young man at the time, and I think the system thought he was salvageable. A couple years later, I saw him working in a fast food restaurant. Seemed to be in good shape, interacting with his co-workers well. Neither of us acknowledged each other. I haven't seen him in any trouble since then. Not a cop, but a year ago South Africa was hit by political unrest and riots. A lot of stores were looted, and people were walking off with multiple TVs, appliances etc. Some citizen journalist was out on the streets, stopping looters, and interviewing them. It's winter, it's dark, and suddenly this little kid appears, holding a single bag. All alone. Couldn't have been more than 8. The citizen journalist stops him, and demands to see what's in the bag. He opens it up. 1 t-shirt. 1 jersey. 1 pair of pants. 1 pair of shoes. A 3-pack of underwear. This little kid had followed a group of adults into a chaotic situation, and taken what he needed, and only what he needed. I can't watch the clip without sobbing. The interviewer sent the kid off with his little bag of 1 single, looted outfit. The final shot is of this tiny little thing, walking into the darkness, barefoot, and alone. It was absolutely heartbreaking. I'm in dispatch, so I don't usually hear what the suspects say, but I do hear what the victims say, especially in the moment when they're still in the heat of it. One night the phones hit hard at about 0230, and let me tell you, nothing good happens after 2 a.m. I take 1, reports of gunfire. Times are like that, and some people don't have constructive things to do other than pop off some rounds. As long as there's no property damage, and loss of life, everything's good, right? I take another, same report, add it to the pile, take down their location to help triangulate. Then I take a third, barely a whisper. Nobody ever says it would be so hot I calm her as much as I can, but shock is one hell of a drug. I get her location, let my coworkers know it's go time, and loop in EMS for life-saving instructions. She was asleep, in her bed, and caught 3 bullets in the lower torso. I think she made it, but I'm just dispatch, I don't always get closure. I worked in mental health, not a cop. I worked in a day program, and a prevocational program. My clients came from institutions, and were doing program as part of their conditions of release. One of my groups ran a hot dogs cart, and they profit shared. After cart expenses, they made very little. They were on assistance, so it wasn't an income supplement, it was more of a perk. Anyways, I has this one woman. She had been a sex worker since she 12, she was in her 40s. Her first week was a nightmare. She was late. Struggled to cut the onions. Spilled everything. But she showed up each day late, frantic, and crying to not be fired. She worked for 1 hour each day. The following week when she came to pick up her pay, a whole whopping $11.50, she burst into tears. I thought it was because it was so little money. She acted as if I had given her $1,000, and an Oscar. She clutched the little envelope, and cried. She said, it's the first money I ever made not on my back. Never thought I could. We hugged, she skipped off happily. Then I sobbed in the bathroom for 5 minutes. Not a cop, but served as an infantryman in Afghan in 2011 to 2012. Was on patrol pretty much doing cop work sometimes. We'd go door to door or compound to compound, and our lieutenant would talk to locals with our translator. During one of the meetings I was inside working as a sort of guard for my lieutenant. The guy he was talking to came up positive for gun trace residue, and was a confirmed Taliban in the eye scanner thing we had. When my lieutenant questioned him before we detained him, he told my lieutenant that he didn't want to fight us, but if he didn't the Taliban would kill his family. I was 18 to 19, and my lieutenant was 24 to 25, now I'm 29, and I realized that war was all fucked. I see some other mental health professionals chiming in, so I'll give mine as well. I work inpatient adolescent, and children. I had this one girl who was about 16. Most actively suicidal child I've ever seen. Her parents used to sell her to their drug dealers from about 2 to 3 years old. She blocked most of it out but suffered from horrible PTSD, and would wake often throughout the night in full-blown panic attacks from flashback dreams. She'd literally wake up screaming, trying to strangle herself with her blanket or grabbing anything in arm's reach to stab or choke herself with. Any loud noise would send her spiraling out of control. Often she didn't remember these episodes after she was medicated and calmed. She's the only patient I've ever had that required 2 sitters at all times, even when she was sleeping. She has serious physical, psychological, and developmental problems from the years of sexual, physical, and drug abuse that she endured from her parents and their scumbag dealers. The poor baby will never be able to live any semblance of a normal life outside of a mental hospital. There was a young lady that we were always dealing with. Long story short, she ended up assaulting one of us during a call. As she was being booked, obviously upset, she apologized and said, "My real parents beat me, my foster parents beat me, my high school boyfriend beat me, my current boyfriend beats me, violence is all I know." It really hit me. She was so young, and had probably never been treated well or with respect by anyone in her life. On top of all this, she was pregnant at the time. We ended up talking for a while. I ended up running into her a year or so later. She again apologized, and seemed like she was doing well with the baby, and in a better situation. Probably the only time in my career I felt like maybe I made a small difference. I'm currently a cop. I was given civil papers to remove a combative elderly male from a residence he was no longer supposed to be living at. He wasn't home, and I ended up talking to his son. I found out he was a military veteran, could barely walk, had dementia, and was hard of hearing. He was being removed from the house due to an infestation because the company didn't want to get sued. When I finally found him, in a restaurant, he just sat there crying because he had no way to get resources to help. I tried to hook him up with programs, called a ton of people. Found out his son worked for the aging services, and refused to believe his dad needed help, and kept throwing his applications away. I called Adult Protective Services, and found the son had friends there too. I was off for a few days, heard he moved out, and never saw him again. I still think about this guy, and wonder where he went. There are a lot of other ones, but that was one of the hardest. I am not a police officer, but for a time I volunteered to implement self-improvement talks within a juvenile correctional facility in Mexico. In Mexico you are considered an adult until you are 18, so everyone inside this correctional facility is under 18. The story that most impacted me, and I still think about it from time to time, was told to me by a 16-year-old boy. He was in jail for homicide. He was a thin boy, dark-skinned, not very tall but not short either, very polite. He didn't say many bad words, and his friends described him as very hard-working and very friendly. What I am describing to you is so that you feel a little what I felt at that moment. He told me that his father was an alcoholic, and when he drank he beat him, and his brothers, and sisters apart from practically raping his mother. This situation was getting worse because it was more and more constant the days that his father arrived drunk, but the worst was when he started mixing drugs with alcohol. In his words, they were the worst moments of his life, the most violent thing I've ever seen. This story is how I remember it. It may not be 100% true, but it is how I remember him telling it to me. The question I asked him is, "How did you end up here?" And he didn't speak for a few minutes, and I saw how tears fell, but after gathering courage he told me the following. "One day my father arrived drunk as usual, and hit us as usual, but something clicked in my head when I heard the screams of my little brothers, and my mom. I had to do something. So I took a knife from the kitchen, and waited for him to fall asleep. I remember that I didn't have to wait long. I stood in front of him, and watched him for a few seconds. I swallowed the fear, and with all my strength I put the knife in his neck. He got up before he could stab him again, but he bled out very quickly, and didn't last much longer. At that moment everyone got up from their beds, and saw what happened, and my mom was crying, and yelling at me, why? Why? But at the same time she hugged me, and we cried together until the police arrived. My mother turned herself into the police saying that she was the one who killed her husband, but I told them the truth. They locked us both up, but when they did the investigation they released my mother. And that's how I ended up here. And that story haunts me to this day. Sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. I worked 20 years in corporate security. One of my responsibilities was internal theft investigations. I've literally completed thousands of investigations over the years. An investigation I completed in Baltimore was probably the saddest. The store had a missing deposit. Approximately $15,000 was gone. It never made it to the bank. The likely suspects were the 4 managers who all had access to the safe. So that was a good place to start. I talked to the first 3, and felt pretty strong that none of them were involved. The last assistant manager I needed to talk to arrived. The first thing she did was go to the bathroom and get sick. The store manager kind of laughed. She said she's been getting sick often. We're pretty sure she's pregnant. I interview her, and she ends up admitting to stealing the missing deposit. She also admits to previously stealing an additional $10,000 in cash and merchandise since she started working for us. She then talks about her drug addiction. She was always clean until about 6 months ago when her boyfriend talked her into trying heroin, just once, he said. A few months later she was a complete addict. I could tell from her physical appearance she wasn't in a good place. She asked if I wanted to see something. She then showed me a few photos of just a year ago, when she was a high school cheerleader. She was very attractive, and I couldn't believe it was the same girl standing in front of me. She said she had good grades, and never did any drugs at all before 6 months ago. Her boyfriend who got her hooked had left her. So now she went to the worst crime, drug-ridden area in Baltimore, and bought the drugs on her own. She said she had another addict friend who would help look after her in such a tough area. Just seeing how she had declined physically, and gotten herself in a very dark place, it was very sad to see. I told her I would agree to reduce charges and diversion as long as she was getting help. I wanted to see proof that she gets into rehab, and some form of counseling within the next couple months. If I came back in 2 months, and she couldn't provide proof to me, she would be charged with grand theft, a felony. I was able to follow up with her once, but that was it. I wish I was confident she somehow was able to turn things around, and get her life together. That this story has a happy ending, but I'm not. Worked a case where a group of lifelong friends got into an argument, resulting in the death of one of them at her birthday. I don't think it will be surprising to anyone that a lot of folks don't typically speak with law enforcement, let alone aid in an active homicide investigation. It's something I didn't fully understand at the time, but was a starting point for me. Having conversations with the best friend of the deceased, and a distant relative that was an inadvertent witness. Both had negative interactions with law enforcement in the past, and it was some of the most heartbreaking work I've ever done to build rapport, having to convince someone that you actually give a shit about their friend that was killed, and that talking about it would actually help. The whole investigation was one of the bleakest things I've ever been a part of. Just senseless violence, deserved mistrust, and a court case that was an absolute travesty. We got our man in the end, but it was fairly hollow. These men had, effectively, sent one of their lifelong friends to prison for killing another. The defense for the accused was one of the most incompetent proceedings I've ever been a part of, to the point that the defense was basically making a case for the prosecution in his closing remarks. There's just not a lot of feel-good stories in police work. For every baby taken out of a hot-locked car, stop leaving your kids in cars, there were 10 homicides, odds, sexual batteries, or domes we had to pick up the pieces of. Not a cop, but was married to one who worked the graveyard shift. He'd get home at 7 a.m., and crawl into bed, and if I woke up, I'd ask how his night went. His precinct had the highest murder rate in our city, so he regularly saw some pretty awful things, and more gut-crushing abject poverty situations than you can imagine. So it's early morning on Thanksgiving Day. He gets home, showers, crawls into bed, and I ask how work was. A bunch of teenagers got hold of a gun, and were playing Russian roulette. One lost, the other teens scatter. One gets home, and tells his mom, who calls the police. Cops get to the address, and a sister comes to the door. The mother and sister are home but slept through the gunshot in their own apartment. They didn't believe a shooting happened, and didn't want to let the cops in. They finally convince them, and the sister walks them to the back bedroom, and is like, "Nothing here. See?" and opens the door to a room that is now essentially painted with her brother's brains. I can't imagine what it was like for any single human involved in this situation, the friends who witnessed it happen, the sister walking in on it, or the officers arriving at the scene having to surprise a family with the news of someone's horrific death that they slept through. Not a cop, but I see a lot of other people chiming in. Former foster parent, Portland area. I had permanent placements, and did emergency placements. I'm going to preface, I treated my foster kids like they were my blood. Still do, years later. Dig deep into my post history for context. Foster kids have it rough. The foster system is bleak, for the kids, and for people like me. My case manager would refuse me respite constantly, telling me I should ask my rich mommy for help. My mother isn't rich, and we are barely on speaking terms. The emergency placements, EPs, were tough. If you are unfamiliar with that, it's immediate, temporary placement for kids recently removed from their homes. Sometimes, removed from other foster homes. Before you take the EP, The caseworker involved would often speak to you, briefly explain the situation, ask if you were comfortable, and able to handle the kids. Sometimes they'd email you a little dossier. They were never accurate, omitted a lot of important details. I never turned a kid down though, no matter what. From babies to teenagers, I did what I could. Meth babies were the hardest, emotionally. One particular placement still gets me. I got a call one weekend for an EP. Foster mom felt threatened by the kid's hostile behavior. He had reactive attachment disorder, and blew up on her. He ended up in a hospital near me. She refused to take him back. Caseworker tells me they'll organize medical transport, and to sit tight until he arrives. It's 4 p.m., I order pizza. 6 p.m., still no kid. Call the caseworker, she's gone home for the day. I speak to her supervisor, who pulls up the file no medical transport has been requested. I offer to just go get the kid, the hospital is close. She refuses, cites some arbitrary guidelines. Supervisor tells me she'll arrange it, but I get her number just in case. 10 p.m., still nothing. I finally get a hold of the supervisor again after hours of calling, who tells me they forgot. They'll get right on it though. Bullshit. I offer to go pick the kid up, or I'll complain to her boss about this mess. She relents. I call the hospital to confirm with them, make sure everything's good, and go. Kid's decent, 13, almost as tall as me, strong build but sweet. Very polite. As we're leaving, a nurse stops me. You can't forget his medicine, she said he'll die without it. At no point did anyone mention this to me. Years later, and this still infuriates me. If not for that nurse, I wouldn't have known, and I would have had a huge medical emergency on my hands. Fast forward a bit, because this is becoming a novel. That night goes well, kids super well behaved, no issues. The next morning, we're having breakfast, and he stops talking to the other kids or looks at me. He asks how long he's staying. I tell him I don't know, because it's true. EPs can last days, weeks, months. They are usually abruptly placed in new homes. There's no set time frame. I could tell that upset him though. He stood up, and said okay, I'm going to leave then. So, big thing about foster care, and especially EPs, you can't let them wander off. If you can, you restrain them. Butterfly hold, as an example. But we were told in extreme cases to sit on the kids. Hand to God, if you couldn't restrain them you called the caseworker, or the police. I ended up putting him in a butterfly hold, had one of the kids speed dial the caseworker for me, the caseworker who simply called the police. He started sobbing, and talking. We ended up sitting on my couch talking until the police arrived. Out of my control at this point, this poor kid just wanted someone, anyone, to give enough of a fuck about him to stick around. But no one ever did. He blamed himself, said he knew he was worthless. He asked me why nobody was capable of loving him, asked me if it was because he was black. As they were loading him up into an ambulance, totally unnecessary, but this was the caseworker's call at this point, he begged me to stay in touch. I told him I would, and he was welcome back anytime. I did try. I tried constantly, emailing or calling his caseworker, but it was always someone new. They said it was inappropriate, or it would not be good for his mental health. So despite my best efforts, I became yet another person who let him down, lied to him, and abandoned him. I know the chances of him ever seeing this are non-existent, but I'm sorry little dude. I'm really, really sorry. Not a cop, but while I was in a holding cell while they were running my warrants they brought in a junkie. He was a 17-year-old kid. They asked where he was born, and he said Kyrgyzstan, then told them that his 14-year-old mother left him with a family member who brought him to the US. He had cysts, and track marks all over his arms. When they asked him why he would do that to himself he just deadpan looked at the officers, and said I was dead a long time ago. The look on the cops' faces was indescribable, they both looked like something died inside of them. I sat there for 2 hours before being released, all that guy did was cry the whole time. Not a cop, and not me, but my ex-wife was a paramedic, and she got a call one night about a girl who had overdosed on drugs in a hotel room. They got to the hotel, got the girl stabilized, and en route to the hospital my wife asked the girl what she had taken. She admitted to have taken multiple pills, painkillers and muscle relaxers, with alcohol, and also shot up some heroin. My wife said she was lucky to be alive, and asked her if there was anything else that she, the girl, thought they, paramedics, should know before arriving to the hospital, and the girl mentioned she was pregnant. My wife asked her how far along, she told my wife about 4 months, and my wife said, "Sweetheart, why would you do this to yourself, and your unborn baby?" My wife said the girl's response was the saddest thing she had ever heard. The girl's response was to say, "Because I'd rather die, and take a fetus with me than bring an innocent life into this fucked up world." Unfortunately, as was the case most of the time in her profession, once she dropped the girl off at the hospital, she never got an update afterwards. I don't honestly know if my wife wanted to know how it ended, but I know the comment hit her hard. As loss prevention, I observed a 14-year-old girl grab a few items from a makeup rack, and conceal them into her purse. He walked out the doors with the intent of stealing them, and I brought her back into my office to process her. She didn't show much emotion, but the one thing that really stuck with me was that she didn't want us to call her house because her mother had cancer, and was sleeping. I called her aunt, explained the situation, and she said that she would pay for everything that was taken, which I couldn't do, but something told me to take it easy on her. So I said that I would let it go if she wrote a letter of apology to the store, nothing specific, just something to show that she learned her lesson. She said would write, and I left it at that, not expecting her to really write anything. A few months later I received an envelope addressed to me. In the letter she said her mother was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, and that she has 2 brothers that she takes care of by herself as her mother is bedridden. Her father is gone, and left them when the diagnosis was revealed. So here she is at 14, taking care of her brothers, and mother, and didn't have enough money to fix herself up like the other girls at school, and felt self-conscious about it. She didn't want to waste money on herself, and would steal items that she needed from stores. She admitted to stealing socks, and underwear for herself, but said she paid for everything that she got for her mother or brothers. She just felt extremely guilty spending money on herself. She sent along with the letter a $100 bill to pay for the other items she took. I called her, and asked to speak with her face-to-face at work. She came down, and I handed the $100 back to her along with a bag of makeup supplies. She explained to me that she wanted to join the military when she got older, because she felt her life was spiraling, and she needed the support. I gave her the number to my local recruiter and told her to call him and he would get her set up as I was friends with him. 3 years later I get a call in my office from the recruiter saying he has someone in his office trying to get into the Marines, but they had admitted to being caught for theft at my store. He said he needed a letter saying that charges were not sought, and that she wasn't actively trespassed. She was absolutely trespassed, as that is the one thing I didn't have control over at the time. However, I ripped up the trespass, maliciously changed things in my computer system, and sent out the letter to get her into the Marines. I felt that I couldn't deny her shot at her dream. Fast forward to last year, she came into the store, and asked for LP. She not only thanked me, but hugged me, and cried. She said that her mother died shortly after she got caught stealing, and her brothers were taken by her aunt while she had to go into foster care. She offered to buy me lunch, but I declined for professional reasons. Otherwise, I felt that she just needed a person to believe in her, and give her a chance. I told her, anytime she wanted to talk, knock on my door. She knocked a few months ago, and we chatted for several hours before she left. I told her how proud of her I am, and that she is such a wonderful person. Just a little bit of caring went a long way with her. That's all she ever needed, just someone to ask her how she's doing. She had nobody. Out of all the things I have done in my job, that makes me the most proud. Even though, if my bosses found out, it would most likely get me fired, but I never cared about policy when showing a little compassion could go a long way. This was one of those times. I have also had a former thief contact me on Facebook, and thank me for giving him the "this is your life" talk. He said he cried for a week, then decided to get sober, and turn his life around. He is now a rehab counselor. I try to talk to everyone that comes into my office to find the reason they have put themselves there. I have got all sorts of wild stories, I'm sure lots were outright lies, but even if lecture them just a minute, and a few seconds of that talk sticks with them, I feel accomplished as a person. My job sucks, but at least it gives me the opportunity to convince people to finally get sober. Obligatory not a cop. Most I've got is that I'm related to one. But I was out with some friends at our usual bar at the time. This was almost a decade ago now. My guys go wander off to the restroom, so I'm alone at the bar with this guy who looks real rough. I could tell he just wanted someone to talk to. Turned out, he just got out of state, and found out his family was dead, and who wasn't dead abandoned him. Was apparently in for 5 years. We talked for a while, on life, purpose, and the like. The topic of religion came up, and, even as an atheist, this hit real hard. If there was a God, the cruelty of it is that of the devil. And if the devil is to exist, I must already be in hell. Since I'm alive, there's no way it exists. The man was completely lost and shattered. At my 21 years of age, I'd never seen anything like it. We talked a while longer, and he gave me a bit of advice that I still hold on to. When life takes everything away, you have everything to gain by starting fresh. Good ending. I ran into him a year later, looking less rough. Turned out he managed to get back on his feet with a halfway house, and got a steady paycheck. Had just started therapy too. Hope you're well to this day, Sam. I was a cop for almost 10 years in my 20s. My point of view shifted a lot during that time. There wasn't a specific thing that one person said I recall, but there was a moment that made me feel more sad than any other. I was chasing a guy who had broken into an old lady's house in his neighborhood. He seemed to get a kick out of running from us. He was young, and incredibly athletic, despite addiction issues, and I'm sure other health issues, and could get away almost every time if we didn't corner him indoors. He had punched a cop earlier in the night to get away from him, and we had him in an apartment in one of the local projects. I knew a fight was coming no matter what we did to de-escalate, and I was ready to scrap. Sure enough, he refused to follow any commands and tried to power through my partner, and me, both wrestlers in high school and college. He kept fighting after we had him wrapped up, and we absolutely demolished him. When his mother came to the hospital to check on him, I put together that he was the same kid we'd met maybe 8 years earlier. He was around 12. His parents were hammered, and high-fighting in the back patio of their apartment as they did every first weekend of the month, GovCheck's weekend. He, and his younger sister were inside watching some very rated R movie. We talked that night about how those two were absolutely not going to have a chance at fulfilling lives or happy families. I immediately felt sad, and terrible for being so excited to fight this guy, regardless if he was asking for it or gave us a valid excuse. I never looked at him the same. It changed the way I handled lots of situations.